Let's start with kind of going down the line. Maybe we'll start with Naren. You were the first. You were on starting the second year. So tell us a little. Let's just talk a little about you. There are biographies out here, but we can get into a little of sort of how you fell into this room.
I think falling in is probably a good way to put it. I had done a lot of science fiction over the years. I had started my career on Star Trek: The Next Generation, and I guess I'd been in the business about 12 or 13 years when CSI came along. The show was a little bit unusual. It had a very, very young writing staff. It was Carol Mendelsohn and Donahue were the experienced hands who were running it at the beginning. And when, at the end of the second season, they were spinning off the show to do CSI Miami, the rest of the staff literally had, the most senior member after Ann Donahue had been in the business just a few years. And so they needed to hire somebody who knew how to run a room and break stories, and so through various, the usual run of meetings and sit-downs, etc., I ended up on the show, and sort of that's how I landed on CSI, and that was about 8 years ago. And Bradley, let's talk about you for a second, just because you're far away from me at the other end here.
Okay.
So to give your, quick sum-up saga of how you...
Well, I'm the new guy on the staff, and this also becomes kind of nepotistic, as I also graduated from Star Trek, in this case Deep Space Nine, and so Naren and I had crossed paths a number of times. At one point we were working on the opposite sides of the same Jim Henson lot. And then Battlestar Galactica, I was a supervising producer on that, and when that was winding down, we called up Naren and begged and pleaded for a job.
And you got it?
Yes.
Wow, that's pretty good. Now, because begging doesn't always doesn't work. Now, Alan, you sort of had you came from a sort of, it sort of comes in the door, and then you've done a few other things before, but let's talk about ER as an example.
Well, I worked on ER for 2 seasons for 2 different writer-producers, and I was basically a writer's assistant on the show, but it was writer's assistant in television can mean a lot of different things, and in this particular case, I worked for the writer, kind of doing their schedule and taking their calls and, fun and exciting things like that, including laundry. But I did that for a couple years, and I wanted to get on ER because I always wanted to be a 1-hour drama writer. That was kind of my passion. I always liked situation comedies, but even if I enjoyed it and laughed really hard, I never felt compelled to come back the next week. With dramas, there was always a hook in my heart, and it would pull me back the next week. So I started there. I worked there for a couple years, and after I left there, because it was pretty clear I wasn't going to be able to get a freelance script, and start a career like I wanted to, I went to the American Film Institute for a couple years, where I met my wife, which was a very good thing because she knew a director on CSI. That's not why I married her.
Can we hear her side of this story?
She's here somewhere.
And we're still married, so. But she knew director on CSI, and she was his assistant. And the writers at that time needed a new writer's assistant because they had promoted their writer's assistant up to staff writer. So I came in and I met with Naren and the entire writing staff, and I was hired, and I was on the staff as a writer's assistant for about 2.5 seasons, and then I eventually kind of got the opportunity. I asked very nicely for the opportunity to write a freelance episode, and that went.
Begged.
Begging works. And that went pretty well, I assume, because they put me on the staff the next year for season 6, and that was about 5 years ago.
And that leaves Corrine, who has a little bit of a different background.
Yes, I do. I was telling Naren that I realized that I started working on CSI 9 years ago today.
Wow.
Yeah. So, wow. But I wasn't a writer 9 years ago, or I should say.
Not only is that longevity, most shows, of course, don't last anywhere near 9 years.
But I was not a writer at the time, and I had just arrived from Chicago, where I was a stage manager. at the Goodman Theater, and I had a 10-year career in theater up to that point, and had worked on.
You know anything about the Goodman Theater? It has done some extraordinary. Well, I
Pretty
think
cool place to work. They say I can still have my job back whenever I want it. So
probably the same pay scale. Maybe.
actually, the first year I was on CSI, I got paid less than I did at the Goodman Theater. But I was an assistant. I came here. I was assistant to Billy Peterson and his producing partner, Cindy Chevadel. And then the second year, I was Danny Cannon's assistant, and he was a director, producer, writer you may have heard of. And actually,
He directed the pilot.
He directed the pilot of all the CSI shows, for that matter. And he was kind of like my film school, because I went to theater school, so I learned a lot from him. And then the next year, I kind of made up my own job. Because I didn't want to leave, but there was no place for me to go. So I asked these guys if I could take charge of all the multimedia, DVD production, merchandising for all 3 shows, and they let me. So I wrote a couple companion books to CSI, and was kind of, the CSI encyclopedia for a while. And then I guess maybe I still am. I don't know.
You still are. I was going to say that.
That's why they keep me around, because I can remember details. And a couple years ago, I wrote a spec for CSI, just as a suggestion from my Producers Guild mentor, who said producers should know how to write. And I'd done a lot of writing up to that point, but not the kind that makes you any money. So so I wrote a spec and gave it to these guys, and they liked it, and they produced it, and then they put me on staff, and that was about a year and a half ago. So.
Corrine is too modest to tell you, but she also won an Academy Award
Oh, that too.
for Best Documentary Short.
Yeah, so I also do documentaries in my free time.
You can bring it up from under the table.
We had to hire her so we could look at it occasionally.
What was the documentary?
It was called A Note of Triumph, the Golden Age of Norman Corwin, who's a radio
You
writer.
know who Norman Corwin is? He's still
alive.
He's
He's
in his
98.
98. He is. I think he's probably using a walker, certainly a cane now, but
Yeah, he's a working walker.
extraordinary history. One, he's a raconteur, beyond belief. But you're stretching with 98 years back into not only the golden age, quote unquote, of television, but the golden age of radio.
Yes, he was a radio guy for sure.
And just an extraordinary human being.
It's a beautiful documentary, too. It's well worth taking a look at.
Naren?
I loved it.
So there's that one, and I did another one on Ladysmith Black Mambazo, and I just finished, or we're in post on one about legally blind photographers. So there you go. That's me,
Now,
It's normal, average career path. Yeah.
now, I know the last panel was about breaking in, and I think you can see here as well that I would say there's no job that's too low or too demeaning, including laundry. But often writers' assistants. It can be a thankless job, but on the other hand, it can open the door or sort of push up the window, and you can be ready to jump in from there. It's I was saying this to someone that as an executive producer of a show or as a showrunner, you are often, let's say, at the beginning of every season, agents are sending you scripts. The pile can be 200 or 300 scripts high. And you can get a pretty terminal headache from trying to get through them all. If you know something about the person, if you like them, or if there's some energy there, it really is a big leg up toward looking at it seriously. But let's talk again. Get to the writers' room, and it's in terms of. Did Carol run? Let's go back to the first year of CSI. Did Carol run the writers' room, or how did it work? Naren, and excuse me, I mispronounced your name before, which of course I'm familiar with because my middle name is always mispronounced. I look at Angela now. But give us an idea of sort of what it was like when you arrived in year 2.
When I got there, from what I understand, the first few episodes, I think, of any show, it becomes like it's sort of all hands on deck. Everybody is trying to find what the voice of the show is. We're trying to figure out what are the kinds of stories that we can tell, and so it tends to be very collective, but often shows will quickly, once they figure out what that is, they'll break off in sort of individualized, more sort of one person in a room kind of story breaks. Now, what had happened on CSI is the show had gotten very big, very, very fast. And so by the end of year 2, there were like sort of there was a much stronger need for like a more disciplined and consistent room. And so when I came into it, we actually started that kind of a process where we would break every single story in the room with the staff, and then one person or two people would go off and write it. And for some of the people on the staff, it was kind of a new experience to have that sort of, consistent discipline of story breaking as a collective group. It is a little weird. I mean, it depends on, where you come from. If you're, if you've done a lot of features, feature writers tend to sit quietly by themselves and, for many, many months at a time and think things through and then do them. Television, you have to have a thick skin, and there's a lot of voices, and it can be very contentious, but it also can be a lot of fun, and it's one of the things I actually like a lot about TV, that sort of chaotic, tumultuous energy that keeps, it's very lively and very fun.
There's a famous quote from William Goldman about ultimately what a writer does is has to go into a room alone. Well, that's not true necessarily in television. If you get to comedy shows, there's been stories as many as 30 writers in a show, sometimes 10 who didn't know about the other 20. Supposedly Roseanne Barr had groups over in certain hotels here and certain hotels there and working.
We did an episode with Chuck Lorre, who was on Roseanne, and the stories that you've heard about Roseanne are all true, down to the numbered T-shirts for the writers. So that's actually a real thing. But that's comedy, which is perversely much meaner and creepier than drama, apparently, in terms of the writing process.
And she had the shirts numbered
Yeah.
because she didn't want to know their names or memorize their names. She would just memorize their number.
This is what we've been told. It's
you're
hard
fired.
to.
Like that.
And that happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Or 12.
But in year 2, was Carol there? Was Ann there? Was Anthony there? Were they still all very present in year 2? Or?
They were all very present, and Carol has stayed with the show since day one. Yeah, I mean, the thing is that they were launching a second show, and Carol, Ann, and Anthony were all involved in that as well. So, that's 2 major headaches. I mean, really, when you think about it, is to keep one show going on the air, to keep the other show, getting into that, get it right into that startup phase. So it's just that the needs had changed really on the staff.
Now, quickly, in terms of obviously Ann going off to do one, and then the coming of CSI New York, are they around it anyway at all now?
The way CSI has kind of ended up is we have sort of, they're 3 kind of separate entities. We shoot in 3 different studios. Miami's down in Manhattan Beach. We're at Universal, and we used to be in Santa Clarita for 5 years, and CBS Radford is where New York is based out of. There's some, connection, through the Bruckheimer Company, but we really are sort of weirdly competitive little entities. We compete for stories and crimes and forensic techniques, and so it's all very friendly and I guess like a family more than anything, but brothers and sisters that you want to mess with.
Like any good family.
Like any good family.
Now, what is Carol's presence now? I know that Ann, for example, has sort of, I wouldn't say step back. She still is there to come in, but it's, she'll come in to do final work often, but she isn't there necessarily day to day to day.
Carol's there day to day to day. I mean, Carol and I have pretty much split up dealing with the show. It's like I'm on an episode, then Carol's on an episode, and so either one of us will end up supervising every episode of the show. And she's just, Carol is so in love with this thing that she created, as why wouldn't you be? And I think by year 10, a lot of showrunners would have just said, "See ya." But she's very attached to it, and we have a very good working relationship. So it actually makes each of us makes the other person's life a little easier.
Now, you talk about sort of alternating episodes. What do you mean by monitoring or, godfathering or godmothering in that sense?
What typically happens is we'll break a story, and then one or two of the writers will take it and actually turn it into a script.
And do people raise hands, or do they get? Do you call out the number of the T-shirts?
Usually somebody will come in with either a story area or an idea. It's sometimes we'll kind of collectively decide to do something, and then that'll get assigned to an individual writer or two. But in terms of when we get to that point, when we're getting close to prep, when the show's going into prep, then Carol or I will take it through production with the writer, generally do a pass or a polish on the script, deal whatever rewrites, and then make...
With, say, one of these three, so they're there. It's not like you disappear. I mean,
no,
some very well-known and very talented writers disappear into, if not Roseanne's hotel, and some other hotel for the last few days to do work, more small or large. And
this show has, Carol and Ann came out of the Stephen J. Cannell School, and I worked early on in my career for guys who came from that shop as well. And Cannell had a philosophy of really throwing people into the production waters, and it was really that. It's actually a very good thing, because I think a lot of times in the business these days you get people who sit in a room and all they do is write, and then their title becomes like, producer, and they've never really been attached to production. We're very, determined to have people from staff writer on to be involved on the set, in editing, in every phase of the process, because as you go through it, that's the only way you can learn.
Let's have, one of you other three jump in about, let's say, I don't know, Bradley, because you're at the other end. Walk me through sort of an experience with a script or on CSI, or give me a sense of from another perspective.
Well, I can go two different ways, because I've been in several different rooms.
Well, let's talk about that, because the rooms are very different show to show. There is no doubt about that. Sometimes, a very famous example, because I worked on the show, was The West Wing, where certainly when Aaron Sorkin was there, the room, whatever the room did, finally, he was going to take the story or the script, depending on what existed, and disappear and come back with something that might be very similar or might be totally different. And that was the process. And it was waiting for a very talented writer to do his thing. And ultimately, those who were in the room, they might get to know the actors, but the script was no longer theirs. I mean, there was no doubt about that. But anyway, you fire away.
What was the question?
Question was, track a little bit some of those different rooms and the
Halfway
personalities
through.
of them.
Well, CSI, for example, as Naren was saying, you come with an idea, and that may be the right idea for the moment. The two showrunners figure that part out and say, okay, this is what we're going to go do next. And generally what will happen is it can go several pathways at this point. One is, okay, come up with a true crime, or somebody like Alan will be working on something that's interesting, and he'll pitch that to one of the showrunners, and they'll go, yes, or oh yeah, cool, or keep looking, and then kind of flesh that out, what that could be, and that's what eventually either gets written down, and they'll approve or disapprove it, and then it'll go to the room and try and figure out what that's going to be. And at CSI, since they're so intricately plotted and intricately connected about what little piece leads you to the next little piece, which leads you to the next little piece, the outlining takes anywhere from a week to 2 weeks in the room. And then the script turns around from there to first draft, and geez, I think it's at one point we've had as little as 4 days. And at that point, okay, now we know what it looks like, and now we can all look at it and say, does this idea hold up? Does this structure hold up? And where do we go from here on that? Because now we have something to look at. And at that point, depending on where we are in the production cycle, either it'll come off of notes or a meeting or something like that, that the next pass will be generated. And then...
Does everyone feed notes to, say, you if you've written that particular script?
On Battlestar, yes. On CSI, no.
The notes tend to come through me or Carol. So
Got it.
people tend to just go that
So there's sort of
direction.
like satellites feeding into a...
Right, and the showrunners are also dealing with network notes and what this whole world of stuff that's just way up there that I don't particularly want to think about. And the concerns they have about whether the lead actress's hair is right and stuff like this.
Important things.
They thought so. And who knows, they could be right. And from that point, the production window is coming very, very close. So we'll get to a first draft that is going to turn into, we're just about at the beginning of production at that point, and then we turn it around to a shooting draft. And usually somewhere in that spot, either Naren or Carol will go in and take their pass at it. And then, depending on where you are in the cycle, they'll throw it back for the changes. And it becomes very collaborative at that point.
So in that sense, you or Carol is often doing some work on each script. It could be minor, it could be more major. I mean, there's
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you may pass it back to the writer to continue sort of, are writers on the set very often? Or
Always.
Always.
Yeah, part of what makes...
Not true necessarily in all the CSI shows. If you
No,
will.
no.
There are
What is
different personalities of different actors in these
Yes,
different
very-
shows. I won't name names, but
Very true.
I don't know who you're talking about.
Yeah.
No idea.
one who won't work after lunch, for example. No.
What makes CSI a little unusual, and maybe this is true of mystery shows, is, as Bradley was alluding to, is the plotting process is very intricate because you literally do have to come up with like the story forwards, backwards, and sideways. And it's like you come up with the true crime, then you figure out, how to turn that into an investigation. So it's like a true crime and then potential false crimes. And then the investigative thread through the false crimes that leads you to decipher the true crime. So it's a very, very intricate kind of plotting that makes it very, very demanding at the outline stage. So there are shows that you'll work on where, because they're more character-based, because they're tightly arced, you can have a much looser break in the room, and that can be, very, very freeing for writers sometimes, because you get a very general sense of what the story is going to be, or where it fits into a larger arc of the season, and then you get to go off and actually, really kind of create people and scenes, and you're not so, you don't have to really be so slavishly, concerned with what the actual plot elements are. But when you throw forensics and mystery and investigation into it, you have to service a whole other set of demands, and that makes it very complicated. And so, because literally they are houses of cards, every one of our scripts. You pull tiny little elements, and the actors will sometimes do it. They go, I want to change that line. You go, no, please don't. It like destroys everything. It's like, and that actually happens. It's one of the reasons we have writers on the set, so that actually is like, no, changes everything. Don't do that.
Bring Kleenex.
How much of that is driven a little bit by act ends in terms of the commercials that you want to do? Tony Gilroy has this phrase called reversal, that you look in scripts for reversals, and you have to be careful that they are fresh and new, but you don't want too many of them. And obviously, in an investigation piece, you have a sense what you think is a lead that turns into a non-lead, or it turns into a false lead, or that something else is discovered that takes you on a dog leg if you're in a golf course. So is that you almost think in that sense that it's structure, if you will, you're putting together almost a model that's the architecture has to work? How do you?
It's a very structured show, and I think mysteries are kind of a structured form. But we tend to, philosophically maybe, we say, we like to play the mystery. So anything that deepens or furthers or changes the nature of the mystery is typically where we like to be at an act out. We still have a 4-act structure, although that tends to be seems to be disappearing even in television, as they try to ram more commercials and commercial breaks into the show, which is brutal.
Probably if you took a look at CSI's first year, or let's take even the second year, the length of the episode probably then was 45 or maybe, let's say 45 minutes. It's now probably running time of 41 and change or something.
They actually went up this year, as television ads get harder to sell, I guess. So they gave us back like 30 seconds of program time. It's the first time that's ever happened, as far as I can recall. But
Now, Alan, how about, were you in the ER room as an assistant? Did you sit in, the outside circle and sort of watch what happened there?
I once went into the ER writer's room. I asked, and that was my reward. And
Then he asked again, and
yeah,
that was that.
and I sat in there, and it was interesting. I mean, they work in a very different way because it's a more serialized show. I mean, they would have medical stories that were specific to that particular episode, but they would sit down at the beginning of the season and they would write out each character, Dr. Green, Dr. Ross, which were all the characters that were there when I was there, and they would do colors. Dr. Green would be in green, and it would say what his arc was going to be for that episode. Then they'd write all 22 episodes around the board, and they would, what's Dr. Green's story, what's that part of his arc for that episode, and so on and so forth through the whole season.
Yeah, the ER is an example. Many shows did this in different ways, but as an example, on ER before each season, there was and in the case of ER, when it became successful, they all went to Hawaii every year, which is not a bad fate, to have essentially like a week of gathering what the arcs were going to be, what Dr. Green was going to be doing for the whole season. Now, it might well change, but there was very much a sense of looking at the season as a whole. I'm not sure, did CSI do that in the same way, or not quite, probably?
But we don't go to Hawaii.
no, we do not go to Hawaii. We have occasionally done.
Why is that?
Can we? Yeah, okay. We've occasionally done season-long arcs on the show. It's very rare. In those instances, we have done that sort of planning, but we're still kind of, heart and soul, we're a very episodic show, so we don't have that kind of need. I mean, Bradley, obviously, on Battlestar Galactica, it's a very, very tightly arced show. Maybe you can speak to that.
Well, it's not quite as tightly arced as what Alan was describing, but it's a little more arced than CSI in the sense that when Ron was going, he would know about 10 episodes ahead because it's cable, and there was a break in between the middle of the season, and you'd want to be somewhere. And he would figure out, like, at the beginning of the middle of, or it was at the end of the first season, he wanted Adama shot and this guy, and his son in jail and the president in jail. And he had no idea how he was going to get there. That just felt right. And then part of our job as the room was to get him there. And so he would go in about 10 episodes or 12 episodes and figure out this is where we want to be. Though at the beginning of at the end of about the first year, we knew where we were going to end the series. So I don't know what that really tells you in terms of arc, but we did end up where we planned to 4 years ago.
I mean, we talk about the arcs at the beginning of the season. Usually we spend the first week doing that, but again, to compare to ER, those 22 episodes would be up on the dry erase boards all season long, where with us, we'll lay out the whole story, and then when it's done, we erase it and we start with the next one.
We have to, what we have to service more than anything is, it's the kind of show where we want the viewers to be able to drop into any particular episode. It's like on ER, for example, you could come into the middle of, the Dr. Green with the brain tumor story, and most of the show you don't really understand, anything that's, the reactions of people, why they're doing what they're doing. It's very tough. We sort of have to, as a result, make much gentler and slender arcs for the year. They have to be almost understandable within the context of the individual episodes, and typically, even when we're servicing them, they're not serviced week to week. You'll do it 1 week, and then 4 episodes later, and then 5 episodes later, and then that's usually the way they play out for us.
And the arcs are deceptively subtle. It's a tough, because the characters don't, as Naren was explaining to us when we first came in, is that what we do in one episode in Battlestar, CSI does over an entire season. And the character work in CSI is extremely subtle, and I'm still learning it.
I guess a good example would be, I think it's season 2, there's an episode where Sarah Seidel touches Grissom's face to wipe something off his face, and they have a real charged moment between them. That's an example of like the
That's a
sideways.
love scene.
That's a
Yeah.
love scene in CSI.
Yeah, that's what Ann Donahue called a CSI sex scene.
Yeah, exactly.
Just wiping some dust off someone's face. Yeah.
It was really about the
Charged
DNA, in
Oh,
fact.
yeah. It's probably like a decomposed body or
Now,
something.
is
he's
it just
wiping on.
because you two knew each other, or is in the widest sense, is science fiction at all relevant to what CSI does? I don't mean science fiction in the woo way, but there's something. I mean, if I think about and Lost in a very different way, and obviously Comic-Con's going on right now, which is this built into this enormous thing. I don't know, but is there something about the science rather than almost the science fiction? Something. I mean,
I don't even know. I'm not even sure. I started my career as an engineer, and I ended up becoming a writer. And most writers I knew in science fiction had nothing to do with science at all. So I think what happened though when I started on Next Generation, after that show ended, it was like, that script as a sample was like, I might as well have had a piece of plutonium I was trying to give somebody. It was like nobody wanted it or would read it or look at it or anything. It was like, it was considered this freakish thing that just existed off by itself. And
aren't some people still making a living? I mean, don't they go to appearances in Germany
Well,
or something?
still.
It's its own way. It's no small thing, right?
Well, but I think what the industry perception of science fiction was
Right.
is that it was its own thing that had no relationship to anything else, the traditional forms of television, and I always looked at science fiction more like a superset of drama. Like you could do a medical show or a mystery show or a cop show or a courtroom drama within the context of a science fiction show, but most people didn't look at it that way. And what happened, I think, over the years was that as more people came out of like the Next Generation and et cetera, they realized that they, for whatever reason, they were reasonably good at breaking stories and structuring stories, and so I think some of the stigma about it relaxed, and the guys at Bruckheimer Television, at a certain point, they started looking into people who had come out of science fiction because they felt their experience was perhaps counterintuitively more broad than other people.
Yeah, I also think it has to do with the audience. I think the audience has
Absolutely.
the culture has changed, where science fiction in the widest sense is now mainstream,
Yes,
if you will.
absolutely true.
Now, Corrine, and excuse me if I'm referencing your theater career again, but
No, that's okay.
since you were obviously, I don't know if you were there at the time when obviously Bob Falls was
Oh, yes.
really taking it to another level. I mean, it was extraordinary in Chicago, but then they started to go to New York and started to sweep the Tonys.
I was
other
there
year.
for the Death of a Salesman.
Death of a Salesman, which
Yeah.
was an amazing, I mean, not that isn't an amazing play, but that certainly was a extraordinary interpretation and performance of it. But let's talk about sort of playwriting versus what you sense in your work on CSI. Is there a way to talk about that a little bit, to the differences, the similarities, or what you might have learned from the one that was useful or not useful?
Well, I guess the similarities would be working on a new play and having a playwright in the rehearsal process with you. So if you're there for a month and going from your first reading, and then at the end of the 3 or 4 weeks you get on the stage and start walking around, the new playwright is usually working with the actors, working with the director, and rewriting as they go, bringing in new pages the next day. And most playwrights probably, like screenwriters for features, probably work alone more than TV writers, of course. But I think that was the most experience I had with collaborating with a writer and other artists in a room. And the most successful experiences I've had, both in theater and then my one experience, really, one very good one here, is that
9 years today.
9 years today. And, less than that in the writing room, although my office was always kind of next door to these guys, so I felt like I was part of them. But when you have a room full of people who come from great different backgrounds, and have different life experiences and different sensitivities to areas, then you usually have a really cohesive group. You may not have found each other out in the world to have been attracted to each other to go hang out and have a drink. You find yourself in this room and you could have very different personalities, but you're all bringing something very different to the script. So in that way, even when you have one or two people writing, the process of coming into the room and starting from scratch, it really has everybody's fingerprints all over it in a way. And Alan does the best writing on the board, by the way. If you ever need someone to write on your board, it's just his whole board thing, although I'm afraid he'll probably have some kind of dry erase marker disease later in his life, but
Dry erase related cancer.
yeah, exactly.
I see an episode coming up.
But I guess like the theater, if you have a dramaturg and a director and a writer, and then of course actors who all have opinions, where we don't really get our actors' opinions until a little later on, and that's probably good.
I want to talk about that in a minute. Because that can be a big factor.
Although there's a lot of producer actors now,
Yeah.
especially Billy Peterson and Anthony LaPaglia, and actors who want to write on their show and direct on their show. So some people see the script a little earlier and adjust. But I think, the broader the experience in the room, I think the more interesting script you're going to get.
If we're looking at ER always had a technical advisors who were doctors. Some of those doctors eventually became writers or producers. Do you all, how much technical advisordom is there? Or is there some one person, or is it so you're drawing outside help, or is some of that inside help?
It sounds like ER is exactly the same as us. It's like we have had technical advisors on the show, which were career criminalists with like the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and CSIs from Las Vegas. Some of those guys have gone on to be writers, and we always have them in the room. I think probably since season 2, there's always been like a real CSI who is also a writer on the show as well. It's just because they're so research intensive, and we tend to reach out very often to the forensics community, like across the United States, and so these are colleagues of these criminalists, people that they've worked with and go to conferences with, and so it's just a tremendous.
Do you have someone, maybe Corrine's in some ways the encyclopedia, this was sort of your role, someone who's almost like a researcher? Their job is to reach out, as well as if it's not happening in the room in terms of that expertise, that you reach out and
we have a dedicated research staff on the show. Yeah.
And how big is that research staff?
There's 2 people. They do a tremendous amount of work on any given episode, but.
And how did you find them? They're not from.
No. But they actually both ended up as actors on the show. They're both researchers and actors. One is our assistant coroner, and one is our tox technician.
Which is great because they can pronounce everything.
I know, it's a
really
big time
good.
saver.
No, but when we're
So if you want, I think the best thing you do is just get a quick, go down to the coroner's office and get a job down there. You can move right into acting and CSI.
We've had a lot of promotion from within on CSI, and it's actually a very nice thing. And that extends to
I appreciate that.
to everybody.
You brought up the actors, and obviously in Death of a Salesman, I've worked with Brian Denny was in. I've worked with him 5 or 6 times, and obviously Billy comes out of theater in Chicago. What are the dynamics with the actors on CSI?
From the beginning, Billy Peterson said that he really wanted to emulate a theater company on television. He felt it was a collaborative experience. He wanted to make it an ensemble situation. He was very involved from the very beginning in working with Anthony and with Carol and really creating this guy Grissom and the team. And I think that, if you set that tone from the very beginning, it just kind of persists into the run of the show. And so that kind of is the attitude baked in. And now we have, Lawrence Fishburne is on the show, and still that dynamic hasn't really changed that much.
So that is, if let's get right down to specific, and in terms of a line of dialogue, how often are they either involved in the script process at that level, or can say, hey, I don't want to say that, and actually get away? I got the domino thing that you were talking about.
Maybe it's personality driven. With Billy, it was kind of like, I'm not going to say that. And he just wouldn't say it. Lawrence is more like, well, how am I going to make it work so I can say that? I just think it's just a different process with different actors. Billy was very proprietary about how his character expressed himself. I mean, very, very meticulous in terms of going through his lines and script. And I think that part of that was he had really kind of built this guy from the very beginning. And so it's hard when somebody takes that kind of, care in creating a character. It's very difficult to argue with them in terms of saying, no, you absolutely wouldn't. He's like, no, I would not. And you generally don't win that argument. But Billy's instincts were great, and we always had a very good working relationship with him. And when he did things, he did them for reasons. They weren't capricious. They weren't stupid. He always had a reason behind it.
He would tend to also bring that up earlier than later.
Yes, absolutely.
I think the few problems we run into are usually when you're under the gun, you're on the set, and then somebody doesn't want to say something even though they've had their script for a week.
Yes.
This is the first time they bring it up. And that's usually, it seems like, because I don't think we're very precious with specific word selection all the time. So if you say, well, if you're going to say this,
right,
and it means the same thing, and you just want to rearrange the way you're saying it,
As long as the intent of the scene is preserved.
As long as the intent of the scene is preserved, that's cool. If you're going to omit something that's going to have the domino effect where, well, now this scene that we've already shot that
would be bad.
In the next act that you weren't in, we have to convince them that there was this other scene that you're not in, and by not saying that, it will affect later. So sometimes you have to stop and take a moment.
Well, the old joke about an actor going through a script is like bullshit, bullshit, bullshit. My line, bullshit, bullshit, bullshit. That can be very bad in a show like ours if there's that kind of attitude. Not that our guys do that. They really don't. They're
well, you can't understand anything. I mean, in our scripts, it's like at the end they'll be like, oh, why am I so upset? I have no idea.
Read the other
50 pages. Yeah.
One of the things that I'm thinking of the late John Spencer in West Wing, who could make the worst line on a page sound freshly minted and real and new. I mean, some actors have that ability to just somehow just tweak it a little bit. You don't know how they do it or why they, especially actors who've been in theater, they really care about what they say, but they also care more than, let's say, television-trained actors about the words because they come from a different school of thought. I mean, my experience with Marg was she could make almost anything. If you thought it was down the middle, somehow it would be said, and it wouldn't be quite down the middle. It was an extraordinary gift. And when you have the right group of actors, believe me, it's helpful.
Yeah.
So what is this chart through, from the beginning to now, the sort of the size of the room, the number of writers, and how it's changed, if it's changed?
I think it's season 2. It was very small. It was
7 or 8 people.
Yeah, it was 8, including me, and that was also including Carol Ann and Anthony, who were sort of doing double duty on things. And I think it's grown a little bit over the years. I think we're at, 9 or 10 now?
We're 10 now.
We're at 10. It's a large staff, in my experience. I mean, again, coming out of first run syndication on Star Trek, we had 5 writers, and we did 26 episodes a year. And it was, I think at the network level, again, for whatever reason, it seems to have expanded. And now we're feeling the contraction, as John was saying, is that it is really happening, is that where the writers' budgets are getting slashed, and they're saying you do not need all of these people, you do not need 17 people in the room. I mean, there's shows, I think, still going on now that have close to that number of writers in the room.
And if you were in cable now, with the exception of probably HBO, which is sort of its own model, I think you could be down to 4 or 5 again,
yeah, absolutely.
even on a show that's seeming to do well. I mean, if you're on a TNT show, unless maybe it's the closer, the writing staffs are
Tiny.
Yeah, I mean the budget of a TNT show or probably a Showtime show or a USA show is
Under $2 million an episode.
right,
Yeah.
and CSI is. How do we say this nicely? Is not under.
He's not under $2 million an episode.
It's getting closer.
Not that close.
So let's talk about, because this is such a successful show, I'm going to call it, I don't know, weariness or a sense that, oh, by the way, in season 3, we forgot that we actually did virtually the same episode as now in season 10. Or is there a danger of that, or how do you stay fresh? How do you, obviously, in a certain way, crime itself offers new variations, but
There doesn't seem to be any lack of like inventive ways that people choose to kill each other. It's quite remarkable, actually, year after year. It's like all of the writers will come in with like stacks of like, can you believe this? It's like, wow. And so, for us, Carol and I actually have had a pretty, we've really wanted to keep the show as fresh as possible. So we've taken a lot of experimental runs, different ways of doing the show. It's like we never stuck to a format, kind of like with the, like Law & Order was very much the Law & Order formula. It's like half of it was the cop stuff and then half of it was the law show, and they really didn't deviate much from it. We've done any number of variations on how to tell a genuine mystery show. We've done black comedy. We've done, 4 little one-act plays per act of mysteries. We've really tried very hard to change it up because, we're going into season 10. It's good to kind of keep it fresh. And the audience, if they like the show at that point, they're going to stick with you. So I think the downside is actually, boring people, because it becomes so incredibly familiar. That sort of is its own tediousness. So the trick for us is, without forgetting who we are in terms of, we're never going to be a soap opera. That's never what the show is going to be. As long as we kind of stay true to what the mystery, crime, forensic roots of the show, I think we have a lot of liberty in terms of how we decide to tell a story.
Now, let me ask you about sort of longevity. Obviously, you seem to have, many staffs, the turnover factor is not small. Mm-hmm. You all, from what you said, sounds like there's been some real strong continuity. So what do you look for? I mean, if I'm, let's say, sitting in this audience and I'm thinking about year 11, mm-hmm. and I'm interested in getting a job, what do you try and take on somebody new in some way, shape, or form every year? Or how do you sort of keep the staff fresh as well as keep that continuity that seems to be working?
Every once in a while we find a writer from the outside that just sort of hits the right tone. It's unusual. Like Evan Dunsky was the guy, he created Nurse Jackie in Showtime. He's a feature writer, but a very odd, weird sensibility and a great voice. And he came in through, I guess, Ken Fink brought him in. He's one of our directors, executive producers, and that was a really nice fit. Here was a guy who had a very odd look at the world, and we ended up doing sort of weirdly funny black comedies, which were also mysteries, which were felt very real and very true to the tone of what the show was. And so every once in a while we have found new people. We have really done a lot of promotion from within, though. That's by and large, our staff has sort of been kind of homegrown.
But in a sense, do you not, my experience on shows is you generally are looking, it's different with the show that's been going on, because the first year you sort of like you're building a ship and somebody's going to either fall off or get kicked off, or sometimes more than one. But your staff is sort of solid and is maintaining, but you're going to have to replenish at some level. People are moving up. Mm-hmm. And how do you go about that?
It's honestly, for the most part, it hasn't been that big of a problem. I was the most senior level hire on the show, and I think to date I am still, I was the most senior person hired after the show started. And That's a long time ago.
Right. I mean, do people, because they become, well-known on the show, then move off to do their own thing? Obviously, in the first
They have.
couple of years, you had, Anthony and Ann moving on, in a sense, to go do, CSI Hoboken or whatever it was.
Well, I mean, Sarah Goldfinger, who was the show's first writer's assistant from, episode 1 on, she became a staff writer on the show. She went all the way up to supervising producer. She did some development, and then this year she finally left the fold, and she's on Brothers and Sisters, about as far from CSI as you could imagine. So, that kind of trajectory, I think, after this many years on the air is going to happen probably more now. I think that, 10 seasons in, people are going to get the itches. We've had, a bunch of people doing pilot development, directors, writers as well. It's eventually going to happen. I suspect that's a problem that's maybe a year away for us.
Let's talk a little bit, since you mentioned it, sort of about the writer-director relationship on the show. And maybe it's one of you all can talk about your experiences and how you work with, and how many of the episodes are directed by, in sort of in-house directors. Just talk a little about how that works. Alan, why don't you say something?
Well, since the beginning, we had 3 in-house directors, basically. Danny Cannon, who we mentioned earlier, who directed the pilot, Richard Lewis, who my wife used to work for, and Ken Fink. And by and large, up until last year, those were the main guys who did it. Danny left season 6, but he came back and did one episode season 8. So once they've done all their episodes, there's some other people now like Alex Smite who come in and do a lot of episodes. But once those episodes have been taken by our in-house people, I would say there's maybe 5 or 6 slots left after that.
Maybe, to give you a sense of scale, I think probably we've done about 205, 206 episodes at this point, and of those episodes, I would say probably close to 130 were directed by Ken, Danny, or Richard. Those 3 guys account for that much of the show. But that's rare to have we had 3 producer-directors on the show simultaneously. That's very rare in the business these days.
Very rare.
Yeah.
And another thing was a testament to Carol and Naren promoting from within and giving people a chance is we have Jeff Hunt, who was our camera operator, is now gone off and been a director. One of our, Matt Beasley, Matterell Beasley, went off to be a director. He was an AD. Al Smite, which is still our editor, so he edits half the time and directs half. I think he's doing 4 or 5 this year, right?
He's doing 5 episodes this season.
Our second unit special effects director, Brad Tenenbaum, has done a handful of episodes. So, and I'm probably forgetting some people, but people have definitely been encouraged. Louis Melito, who was our AD season 1, moved up to line producer, is now a co-exec. And
then
also
our
has been
most
directing.
recent promotion is that Naren is about to go into prep on his first directing episode.
Oh, yeah. Yoo-hoo!
He loves
Don't clap now. Really?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. Because often it comes not only from a DP or an AD or a UPM, usually often writers want to do that, and you will be, well,
I will be actually the first writer who's directed on the show.
That's true.
Yeah, we have not done that particular
We have
one.
had directors try to write.
Yes, that's true, but
not
not from the staff. Not from the staff.
Now, is there, let's say you have a guest director and the writer of the episode is dealing with that. Is there a different relationship? Because, I mean, obviously with Danny or Ken or, you probably know each other pretty well, so that if you're on the set or if you're prepping the script, I assume how do those conversations work with a producer director, and then is there a difference in terms of authority even with a guest director?
There is. I mean, that's sort of the nature of the beast. The producing directors have a lot more leeway. They have a lot more familiarity with the production. Guest directors are. It's a tough role to kind of come into. I think on any show, it's like it's because you're kind of the hired hand for the week if you're the guest director, and you tend to. The producers will put the screws to you. You get held to a little bit of a different standard. It's tough. You feel. I think some people come in, they feel they can't challenge the material some ways that that our in-house guys can. It's kind of a tough gig, and I think the ones who navigate it well, obviously you end up using them over and over again. And but it's a tough gig, I think.
Now, let me open this to you all for some questions, and let's start firing away since I haven't had a chance to look over here.
For the last 15 years to supplement my life as a writer, I've been a 911 operator and a police service rep. So when the show first came out, at least once a week we would get a call. I got to complain. The detectives just left. My house got broken into. They didn't bring a blue light. It's true. I always wondered, because I'll watch them, to get it right every time. Do you get that occasional where the show goes off great and then you get this letter from some little old lady in Duluth going, you could have done this?
Short answer is yes.
They're not short letters, though.
You would know more about that than me. You actually go ahead.
Corrine, you take care of this. My other job. David Rambo also has taken on a lot of the fan customer service in a way.
That's a really good way to put it.
It's kind of, I think it's kind of like, we talked about this, about the simplicity of season 1, when it's like we take out a Q-tip and go, oh, it turned pink, ooh, ah, If we try to do that this year, people are like, yeah, I know, the pink Q-tip. So, people have gotten smarter as we have learned more about this, and as technology has gotten more in the press. So yeah, people are smart, and we try to write up to the audience level. But I don't think we always. I think we have a healthy number of our episodes. The guy got away, or the crime wasn't solved, or it was open-ended, because there is something a little superhero-ish to solving every crime and wrapping it up in a bow.
Cops and detectives hate us, by the way. It's like they do. They really hate us. They go, every time you talk to a cop and then you say you're on CSI, he goes, oh, crimes don't get solved that way. It's like,
And
yeah,
not in 44 minutes either.
I know.
Now, but let me ask you: have you gotten grief for, in a sense? I've heard this about other things, that you have actually helped crime by showing techniques, how to protect, how not to do something, or how to do something.
You do hear that, but it's like, I think, a more thoughtful analysis of that is you've also educated juries about evidence. You've also done, now we don't have to deal with a jury not knowing the DNA is a useful tool to actually say a bad guy did something. I don't think there's a lot of evidence for we're helping the criminals to to beat the rap. Those guys aren't watching our show anyway. It's like, and as our criminalists will tell us, it's like, criminals, when you're locked up, all you do is think about how to beat the system. That's all they do. They're very inventive all by themselves. They don't need us to help them. And, it's like it's a technological war in a way. It's like every time you come up with a way of beating something, it's like the smart dudes who are coming up with the tools, they come up with some other thing that makes it a little tougher. So I think that's just the nature of the beast.
Here's a question. 1 minute.
You've also sort of encouraged some of them to not do things because of all of the technology.
Exactly. That's the flip side of it. Is
Sorry.
Yeah, that's the flip
There's
side.
no way I can beat this because of all of this science that goes along with it. So that may be the other side of it too.
That's true, and I'll tell you one of the very rewarding things about having been, part of this show is when we started, when CSI first came on the air, there was a handful of forensic science courses in the United States and around the world. It has exploded in the last 10 years, and it's largely in part a testament to people seeing that this is an interesting career. That science can actually do something. It's like it's like being told that algebra can actually solve a problem in the real world. It's like, oh my God, it's a revelation. And what's happened is these courses have sprung up all over the country, and CSI has supported forensics science endowments at the University of California. Our cast goes to Congress to testify for funding for crime labs, and it's amazing when you see, like, when we go to Las Vegas, and we do this every year, we go to Las Vegas for research, et cetera, they're adding shifts. It's incredible the number of, like, 24-year-old, typically women, who come into criminalistics, and they're walking around with guns and swabs and DNA and blue lights, and it's like, it's really, and all of them will say, it's like, well, I saw that when I was. And
Let me just ask you a sort of a logistic question. With that staff and assigning, how many scripts is the average that a writer does a year?
it
in a
varies,
season?
but 2 or 3 typically.
And how much is aimed toward, let's say, what you know about them, or the season ender? I mean, are you and Carol essentially doing the last show or the first show, or how is it just depends?
I tend to do the finales and the openers. That's usually what I end up with. But yeah, I mean, everybody has a sort of a different, I guess, specialty, maybe is the way to put it. I mean, one of our writers on staff, Dustin Abraham, he grew up in Las Vegas. When he was 16, he was running numbers for the mob. I mean, he would run around with $300,000 in cash in a backpack, laying down bets for sports bookies. And it's like, so, and he grew up with, like, the kids of, Joe Pesci's character in Casino. It's a real guy, Tony Spilatro. It's like the sons of hitmen for the mob. I mean, it's like that. So Dustin is like, boots on the ground in Las Vegas. He understands the sort of the history of that place, and he still lives there. So, the sort of Vegas-centric, peculiar stories, those tend to come out of Dustin.
So, 2 things. One is, how did he find you all, or you all find him? And number 2, if he still lives in Las Vegas, does he come out for writers? How do you handle the road?
He commutes. He goes back for weekends. But he's Anthony Zeiker's childhood friend. I mean, they grew up together. And it's like, so, Anthony's first script was actually about Dustin. He wrote it. It was called The Runner. It was about a guy who runs around town with $300,000 in his backpack, laying down bets for the sports book.
Should I go ahead? I have a question.
Okay, hold a second. I think you're next.
Bradley and Naren, you were saying that you can spend as many as 10 or 12 days beating out the story in the writer's room, and then the assigned writer might spend as few as 4 days actually writing the script. And I'm just wondering, how much creative flexibility does the assigned writer have in terms of, being in the flow of the story, I've discovered this whole new angle that we hadn't considered that's really great. How much flexibility do they have to explore things that weren't considered in the writer's room?
The exploration happens, if you'll get an idea or you'll see another direction to go, you'll walk back to Naren and say, hey, I got this idea, this could go this way. And so right in the middle of that 4 days or 5 days, we'll make the call of, well, does that happen in this draft or does it happen in the next one? Because it's not, we're not locked in a room and never communicating. A lot of this show is communicating with the people, the showrunners, and with each other. Because I work with a partner, David Weddle, and I've worked as a team for my entire television career. So we're very used to going, oh, we got this really hot idea, we'll run that around. There's a little mini room, mini conference. And do we want to go that direction, or we want to try and make this? And oftentimes you'll get in there and something is not working. And you're like, okay, how do we fix that? Well, there's an immediate, you get an idea of how it may be able to fix. You may come up with a fix, and then you'll run it by your partner and the other people that are involved in this and say, do we want to try it now, or do we want to come up with a different solution? Does this solution work? So in terms of that, you don't just go off and kill a lead character and come back and say, hey, surprise. You'll come up and...
If you have, I think some people have a tendency to think of, a story room as like the less creative side of the process, and then the script writing as the truly creative side of the process. And again, it really depends on the type of show you're in, but I've often found that that room is a tremendously creative place. And depending on the detail to which you lay out your stories, you can lay out an incredible blueprint for a wonderful episode of the show, it may actually represent, when you're at the end of the day, a 25-page outline for a 52-page script. I mean, it can get that detailed. I mean, sometimes we go, we have a room, it's literally surrounded with whiteboards. It will go all the way around the room. Now, you can also loosely break a story, with bullet points and have it just be like, one tiny section of a room, in which case you are going to find a lot of, stuff that you may not have thought of at the script stage. But it really depends on sort of how the whole thing comes to be.
Let me ask you procedurally, if we start on a Monday, I mean, how often do you have writers' meetings? How often, and who are in them? Or is it mostly once you get started, these mini meetings? I mean, if I'm a writer, how often am I going to be in the writer's room, and how big is that room going to be, or does it change because we're now on an individual script?
It changes. I mean, depending on...
So it's not like 3 times a week, or there's no set formula?
No, because somebody will be writing, somebody will be on set, somebody will be, coming up with new ideas, and a few people will be...
What about the beginning of every season, when you're beginning? Do you then meet consistently for 4 weeks or 5 weeks before you start shooting, or how does...
We're all there the first 2 or 3 weeks, and then once we break the first couple episodes, those episodes get assigned writers, and they're gone, and then the room gets progressively smaller down to like 5 people, and then that cycle begins of production and editing, and people are coming in from their episode, and some are going out.
But normally, are you meeting like Monday, Wednesday, and Friday as a writer's room, whatever the size or shape of it, or not?
Our attempts at creating that kind of a schedule have been disastrous failures. It's like every time we say, all right, 9:30 in the morning, but it's like, no, it never happens. So it's just kind of, it's really... What happens is when the thing starts moving, you're scrambling kind of all the way to the end. I'd be lying if I told you.
And in that sense, I mean, I know from working on shows, for me, it was always like the marathon, somewhere about 16 or 18 in. It's like, you thought you were going to die and you wouldn't have anything in front of a camera, and then suddenly you actually did, and then you sort of felt like you're sliding home a little bit.
Well, David Mamet had this great quote. He said, making a movie is like running a marathon. Making television is like running until you die. It's so true.
Now, speaking of that, how much time off do the writers have at the end of the season before they start again?
They get more than me.
Because he's the showrunner, he has to follow post-production through all the episodes, so he tends to hang around all through hiatus.
And how tight does it get? I mean, certain shows, I've literally been in an editing room where the film or whatever left on, say, a Sunday morning at dawn and was on the air 2 days later.
Oof, we don't go quite that tight. We've had very tight turnarounds, nothing that bad, because we have a fair amount of effects work and post-production, even in the tightest turnaround shows. I think we've gone about maybe, I think an 8 or 9 day turnaround is like really in terms of final daily to air, but that's incredibly tight for us.
To go back to one thing we were talking about, in terms of being able to write a script in 4 days without the outline being that tight and that well thought out and that well created, literally created in the room, there's no way you could do that.
Your turn.
Okay. My question is, you've talked about this being very tightly scripted and constructed because of the concept of the show and all the technical aspects. How do you make sure that you have a certain percentage of relationships and humanity and the personal part of the show? Do you have a certain formula that you should do so that it's not too technical?
P equals character by...
Only 3 touches the cheek a year, or 1 every 5 years. Yeah.
The thing with procedurals and crime stories in general is a lot of the sort of moving stuff is on the guest cast. It's like the people who actually commit the crime, the people who are victims of the crime. That's where a lot of it is focused on. What's tough for the actors is that the regular cast are the people who get to emote the least, because the show, and Billy always described it this way, is about people at work, people doing a job. And when you meet these guys in real life, they do not connect to every crime. They do not connect to every victim. It's a form of self-preservation. If they did, they would just be blowing their brains out at the end of every single shift. It's sort of the attitude the show took was, it's kind of a quietly heroic profession. It's the things that they said in the early years of the show where we speak for the dead, and that's what we try to keep our guys doing. So the regular cast is an occasional moment here and there. The guest cast, they have the big moments in general, and that's just the approach that we've taken.
I think actually CSI, among other things, has sort of changed acting in some ways. That there's a sort of underacting that goes on.
Better?
So I mean, more in the sense that, in soap operas, if before a commercial, the lead actor or one of the turns, used to turn toward the camera and go, or something. And I think everyone sort of went, enough of that, and that you can, within the grain of men and women at work, feel the emotion without having to go, here it is.
Yeah.
And I think the audience gets that in many cases.
Yeah, we have the Billy Peterson patented eyebrow lift, things like that, subtle. No, but to add to what Naren was saying about the, layering in personal beats for the characters, it's been my experience that those tend to present themselves when you have a story that is going to resonate with a character's backstory or something they're going through in their lives. So you see an opportunity. So if Marg's character Catherine is dealing with a 16-year-old victim and her daughter is 16 years old, you have an opportunity to kind of create a moment, but it's pretty subtle.
Mm-hmm.
We generally develop our characters. We find out who our characters are by the way they react to their work.
Well put.
Thank you.
Over here.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for coming. Question about you guys, obviously it's a collaborative teamwork, it's very important throughout at least the last 10 years. Have you had any experiences either on your current show or your prior experiences where somebody's not part of the team, whether they're maybe less likable? Do they get talked to? Do they just get kicked out the next week? Like, because everybody seems like very happy here, which is great. So I want to know if that's actually an example of the industry. I don't think it is, but I just wanted to know what the process is.
It's an example of really good showrunners.
Yeah, it's true.
That pick their people and manage them well.
Believe me, all shows, the chemistry is different on almost every show, and that would apply to writers' rooms. It also applies to who the actors are. I mean, sometimes on a show it can be very successful, and dealing with an actor can be a nightmare. And sometimes, in a way, talking about just The West Wing as an example, that was not a communal writer's room. That was a room that eventually was going to just take whatever came out of it and would go to Aaron for the first several years of The West Wing. In the last years of The West Wing, it was just the opposite. It was much more like it's being talked about here. So writers' rooms are different on different shows. But it may be that part of the success of the show is indeed that they've able to put down a root system and have a fabric that has a consistency.
I've been on a lot of staffs over the years, and I will say this is the kinds of bad apples that you're describing, they tend not to last very long in TV because you spend so much time with your staff. I mean, we spend more time together than we do with our families, and that's just the sad, ugly truth of what the job is. And it's if you have somebody who doesn't like to play well with others, that word gets out very quickly. Those people, after a few experiences, they tend not to be in the game. There's always, sadly, exceptions are always made for people, who are complete jerks but have incredible talent. I mean, that's just sort of the way it is. But in general, those people tend not to want to be in those situations. Other people tend to not want to have them around. So you usually don't deal with it too often.
Way over here.
Hi there. Since procedural writing is so execution dependent, and mystery is a very evolving form of storytelling in that, what was surprising 5 years ago, audiences are way ahead of you today. So I'm wondering if any of you have any suggestions as to a reference that helps to lead you as a writer to the important elements of procedural storytelling and how to sort of structure your story in a way that continues to stay fresh and, current.
I have to think about that.
That's such a good
That's
question.
very
I'm not
good
sure there's an easy
question.
answer to it.
Yeah.
One of the things that happens with a really good, I'm thinking about movies too, is that if you do something that seems really fresh and new, sometimes it loses its freshness and newness because so many imitators come along after it and do it usually less well or even outright badly. I think the flip side of that is that if it's really good enough, it has a half-life, it maintains in some way. Obviously, when the writers come in and go, you won't believe this from the newspaper, I think you have a sense that this writer's room, at least, is going to try and stay on the cutting edge of what's happening and therefore not lose sort of its currency. But I think it's probably a question that subconsciously is going on all the time.
I'll tell you, I think, for just speaking for myself, because I don't think the show really has a philosophy about it, is when I look back on the shows, the episodes of CSI, and we do this fairly often, we'll go back and just sort of see something. The shows that stick with me are the ones that tend to be simpler. There's not a lot of reliance on, whatever the latest cutting edge technique was or whatever, and it's about shows that have, I think, universal themes, great story. I mean, sort of great moving stories that are emotionally and character driven underneath the crime, even though it's realized in a procedural way. It's like when the forensics can reveal character, when the forensics can reveal psychology, when the interpretation of the crime gives you a window into the people who actually committed these acts, those are satisfying stories because you feel like you're not just connecting a fingerprint to an interrogation, to another little piece of hair or a fiber. You feel like you're unfolding and peeling back a human being. And the great compelling draw of crime drama throughout human history is understanding why somebody would violate this great taboo, for human beings. It's like you have taken the life of somebody else. What drives you to do that? That's ultimately the fascination with crime drama, is figuring out that, understanding, all of the little bits and pieces of evidence, cutting through lies, being as objective and as reasonable as possible, interpreting something properly and arriving at the truth. That is a comforting thing. When you can do that, marry that particular journey with unfolding an individual and seeing who they are at a very, very deep and base level, that's what a satisfying story is, and that's what I would say is probably what to aim for.
Yes.
William Peterson's character was, of course, the paternalistic fellow who kept his family from getting too dysfunctional. Occasionally had a card up his sleeve to solve that crime. What was the response in the writer's room when he said, I'm kind of getting tired, I want to leave?
That was season 2.
That sounds like a joke, but
It's not.
Billy.
Okay, season 1.
Okay, I sincerely believe that Billy what he was aiming for was a critically acclaimed failure. I think he wanted to have a show that was critically acclaimed and lauded and then off the air in 13 episodes. I really do.
Twin Peaks, Murder One.
It was because Billy was he is a creature of the theater. He became an actor so he could be lots of other people. When he was forced to be one guy for 10 years, it was like a nightmare. I mean, that is the great trap of television for actors, and it's, to Billy's credit, when he said he was ready to move on, he said, look, I want to get back on the stage before I'm too old for this. And what did he do? He left the show and he went right back on the stage in Chicago. He did a play, he took a month off, and he's back doing another play. I mean, he did exactly what he said he was going to do.
But he came back for another season?
Nope.
And then he said, I can't do that. He left the show for a few weeks to do a play out in Providence or something.
We're talking about two different things.
Then he came back.
We let Billy out to do a play in season 7. He actually left the show in season 9. But when he left the show for good in season 9, he did it because he wanted to go do theater. And he's on his second production in Chicago right now, actually.
Now, he's still an executive producer.
That's correct.
And does he read scripts, or is he really just sort of, he's out there and occasionally, or what is his participation now?
I don't know if he's reading the episodes. He's certainly watching them because he's telling us, I like that, I didn't like that. So we're getting that. But I think it's partially his theater schedule has been pretty intense. I mean, this last play especially, he's playing a pedophile. It's some intense stuff. So I don't know how.
But my original question is how did you all respond when you said we're going to lose the core of our show? How do we deal with that? Obviously, getting a very talented actor, William or Larry Fishburne, certainly helps, but there had to be other considerations.
It's hard. I mean, it's not something you ever want to hear. I mean, if I'm going to be honest about it, it's like Grissom was the face of this show. He was a unique, fascinating, accessible but distant genius. I mean, he was he was our Sherlock Holmes in a show that's about solving crimes. So the thought of having him leave was very daunting. It's something that shows face when they're fortunate enough to run 10 years. It's an inevitability. People want to move on.
Now let's face that from almost your perspective and sometimes the network's perspective, which is usually it's often talked about at some point of replacing people, bringing new blood in, or sometimes it's about salaries or about money.
Sure. So
have you had those conversations, or are you guys able to sort of say it's working? I mean, obviously there are a couple of exceptions that we can point out. But
we've had CSI has had a lot of cast stability over the years, more so than most shows that get this long of a run. Recently, we've had a lot of a fair for us more so than usual cast turnover. We lost 3 characters in the span of about a year and a half. Networks talk about new blood. You bring in new characters. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It's hard. It's like a good writer's room is about chemistry. Casting is about chemistry. The shows that become hits have that chemistry at the outset. When that chemistry changes, people go, that's not quite the show that I remember. Yeah, you just have to deal with it. That's part of the game.
Ma'am, right here.
Hi, this question is for Alan and Corrine. So when you received your first episode and you're sitting at home and you're writing it, what went through your mind? And did you call each other? I mean, it's like, oh my God, I don't know what to have Grissom say. Or how did you handle that? Because one day I'll be on the show, I will, and then I'll have a script, and because when I write specs, I'm always a little nervous. But to have it produced, how is that? How did your wife react? See, it's good you married her. I mean, it worked out.
It was incredibly exciting. I had wanted to do it for about 8.5 years. I've been working in TV for a very long time. Well, it seemed like a very long time, 8.5 years. But once I got on CSI, I had a feeling that it was probably finally going to happen, and when I finally got the opportunity, it was tremendously gratifying. My wife was over the moon about it because I wouldn't have gotten that job if it weren't for her. She's the one who went to Naren and Andrew Lipsitz, who was on the show at the time, and talked me up. But as far as being at home writing that first episode, I had wanted to do it for so long and felt that I on some level could do it, that it was like a relief to finally get the opportunity to do it. It was scary because when you first sit down to that blank page and I was writing the teaser, I was very aware at that moment, and I never have been again, that like 25 million people were going to watch it. But once you do that first episode, you never think about it again, because in reality, you're not writing for 25 million people, you're writing for 2, and one of them is sitting right here. And so, that which is even more intimidating. No, I'm just kidding. But it felt really good. And as I knew I was already friends with Corrine at that time, and Corrine was very supportive of me writing and put me at ease while I was doing it.
And that's feelings mutual. I kind of kept it a secret that I was even working on something because I wasn't sure how it was going to go. I wasn't feeling the most confident that it was going to work out, and partially because after being somewhere for so long and kind of being a fly on the wall for so long, I've heard all the criticisms and all the things that don't work, and so I had to try really hard to not fill my mind with everyone's voices saying, oh yeah, this script doesn't work because X, Y, and Z, when you're trying to do something new and come up with a new idea. My husband, who's a writer, is the one who said, just, ass and seat, there's the keyboard, do it, And so I finally did it, and it worked out, and I think it's a really odd way to get a job, really, because usually you don't hand in specs of the show that you want to get on, and I just looked at it as it was kind of a learning experience, and I thought, I can just use it as a sample. If they don't like it, no big deal. I actually, made it more of I'll put an emotional scene and an action scene and try to show off that a little range, and it actually stayed remarkably the same.
It did. Corrine's spec script was an outstanding spec, and usually the common knowledge, as she mentioned, is that you don't write a spec of a show that you want to be on, because when somebody from that show reads it, they're going to be very critical of it. But the exception with Corrine is that she really did know the show that well.
Strangely, when she turned it in, she had her Oscar with her.
Let me ask you, because every year you have to deal with spec scripts, and do you try, and there are still rules and regulations around it, that at least an episode's going to go to a non-staff writer? Is that still happening? At least it certainly wasn't a few years ago.
Yeah, we still commit freelancers every year. We have traditionally given our assistants chances to do it, and that's sort of become, I think, pretty standard operating procedure in the business. And from that, we've had people come on staff and progress. So, we don't accept spec scripts for CSI. I've been on shows that do. I mean, on Star Trek, we had an open submission policy, which was unusual in the business, is that Paramount would send out a release because there were so many fans of the show, and we would get 3,000 scripts a year. I mean, and people would go through and every once in a while, something amazing would happen. Like Ron Moore came from a spec script that he submitted, and the staff of Next Generation all came from either interns or people who had written specs that just went into what we called the slush pile.
Is it legally difficult?
There was a written release that Paramount would require you to send in with the script. So, but it was the showrunner Michael Piller. It was his policy. Said that we have a great fan base. That they are very devoted to the show, and who knows? It doesn't cost us anything. It's like we would get a couple of stories or little kernels of ideas that we would turn into shows, but that's very much the exception. It's sort of, I think, it kind of dates to an earlier time in the business. I would be surprised if there's any show out there that does anything close to that.
Any other questions?
This lady here.
We're down to the wire here.
Last one. An earlier panel I talked about the research screenings in the pilot process. I was just wondering how that continues on a show that's been running for 10 years. Is there any market research feedback that you're getting on a regular basis, any touchstones, and if that makes its way into the room with you?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. Especially when you add cast members, when you put new regulars onto the show. The networks are very sophisticated with the kind of feedback that they can get. CBS for ongoing shows has a very deep sort of list of people that they can go to. They get feedback on every episode, so they can look at that research, in an ongoing way. But where it tends to come up in a long-running show is when you do change cast, when you do get new people in. People want to know the reactions to it. Occasionally, we'll look at the response to a particular episode if it's something that odd for us or more comedic, let's say, than we've done. Was like to see how that was responded to. It's a little, for me, that kind of testing is more accurate and more informative than just going on to like a chat room or a blog or anything like that, because in general I find that you get a disproportionate sample when people post comments. It's usually people who like to rag on something, and so you get and the people who like it tend not to say things about it for the most part, especially for a show like ours, so it gets a little bit skewed, and the research is usually better in that regard.
Well, thank you all for coming, and